Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Allen at the Garrison Church of God. I'm glad you joined me. We're going to be looking at the concept of when I need refreshing. All of us, at one time or another, want a vacation. We want some way of getting away from everything, of having a time of refreshing or a time of renewal in our lives. But that may require that we re-examine some of the things that we have thought. I looked at some of the most popular destination places in the world, and not surprisingly, Hawaii is on that as a destination. Alaska, believe it or not, is on that as a destination event. So especially in this year of COVID, we're all kind of wanting a place to go or a vacation or some way of dealing with the stress and the frustration that is a part of our world. An interesting man in 1596 wrote a book that would have dramatic impact, far more than I think he probably thought at the time. For him, it was more of an intellectual exercise, I'm sure. It was quite satirical and also somewhat wistful, somewhat of a desire for things to be different than they were. It was only 3 years before the posting of the 95 thesis on the Wittenberg church door. It was only 5 years, not even quite 5 years, from the point at which the Reformation would begin in 1521. It was a period of tremendous turmoil in Northern Europe. And this particular man began writing this book a year before as he was an envoy to the Netherlands. There was a peace conference between England and France, and it was being hosted in the Netherlands at the time. And he was on that particular delegation. He was an up-and-coming politician in England. That particular book would, in a sense, become his most famous book and yet his most difficult book to understand. It was complex and convoluted. He was disillusioned by a lot of the things that he saw at the English court, and a lot of things that he saw in politics in general in his era, just like we may be discouraged by the political circumstances of our own world. He would return to England to become one of the most powerful men in England. The book itself would be edited by his good friend Erasmus, who was one of the great thinkers of that era. The book, when it was published, would have a dramatic impact in the world, but it was written in Latin, so it had very little impact in England until after the death of its writer. The man who wrote it would, 19 years later, choose death over dishonor by a king that he loved dearly but could no longer respect, and a church that he disliked but had come to respect. This complex man in a complex age wrote the book Utopia. It is a play on words, particularly a Greek word. Utopia means nowhere, but it sounds like the word utopia, which means good place. And so it was an intentional play on words. Karl Marx would famously quip, "Religion is the opiate of the people." Certainly in 1515, when Thomas More began to write Utopia, he might well have agreed with this very observation. In fact, surprisingly, the Communist Party in Russia identified Thomas More as kind of a patron saint for his picture of communism in Utopia, or socialism in the book Utopia. I think they must have missed the meaning of the word utopia because it means nowhere. This is an idea that doesn't work in the real world, is what Thomas More was saying. Erasmus, his friend, certainly agreed with that observation. He had attacked very much the corruption and the foolishness of religious activities at the time of before the Reformation. He felt much of it was muddle-headed and escapist. And he looked at the corruption and was deeply, deeply troubled by it. It seems to be something that Thomas More is troubled by. But utopia is not just about religion, it's about politics and the disgusting and difficult world that the political world was at that time. It's kind of funny how it kind of stays the same. As Solomon would say, nothing is new under the sun. Yet, both of these men, in their struggle with the forces that were surging at the very dawn of the Reformation, would come to see their faith as pointing to a reality far beyond the trappings and the failings and the corruption of the organization that represented that faith in their lives. Protestants who were looking at it from the other side of the equation would struggle just as much to make sense of the confused world that made up Northern Europe. Some would eschew the politics and retreat into an ideal world in a quest for heaven on earth. Others would delve into the pragmatics of their culture to the point that their faith would become impotent and even non-existent. Mob action and autocratic responses would dictate the politics of their day. In fact, the politics for over a century. It would be a difficult time as war after war after war swept over Europe. A century and 14 years later, a man who would be the future governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, on his way there, shared a sermon with the rest of the colonists that were going with him. The ship that they boarded was the Arabella, and his message would leave a permanent mark on the American conscience. The message was a model of Christian charity. But in it, he would popularize the idea of America, the city upon a hill. He would be quoting from Matthew's Gospel in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus calls upon Christians to see themselves as a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. That the things done there are going to be important in the world, and that was sort of the beginning of the concept of what we call now American exceptionalism. John Kennedy in 1961 would evoke this statement himself, and also Ronald Reagan in 1980 would, on the night of his election to the presidency, reprise John Winthrop's words by declaring in 1980 that Americans still desired to be that shining city upon a hill. The writers of Psalm 46 in verse 4 talk about the river of life that flows through the city of God, the city that is the dwelling place of God. It gives direction and comfort and refreshing to that purpose and direction. Winthrop would talk about the need for Christians to practice justice and mercy, to create a society built on that very concept. It is one of the most difficult parts of being a Christian in this world. We struggle against losing our perspective, either by trying to make the world heaven on earth, or worse, making heaven this world. We need that refreshing opportunity to regain perspective and direction. Like most of us, Winthrop fell short of his ideals. Justice and mercy are unnecessary in a world without sin. The forbidden tree in the garden was not the tree of sin, it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When humanity knew evil, then justice became a reality. Justice is the need to restore rightness to the world. But when everything is bent, is broken, as it were, rightness destroys things as much as corrects them. That's why we need something called mercy. Mercy is what we provide to somebody when they have broken the rules and cannot achieve it themselves, when right is out of balance and we desperately need right to work again. Grace is the foundation of mercy. Grace is that water flowing, as Ezekiel envisioned it in chapter 47, from beneath the threshold of the temple. It is that which grows quickly into a river that provides strength and provides life. It also provides healing, because on the banks of that river in Ezekiel, it talks about trees, and the leaves and the fruit of those trees are the healing of the nations. This is the image that John picks up in Revelation chapter 22, when he speaks about a river flowing from the throne of God that is in the New Jerusalem. It is the promise that the world will be better. Refreshing comes when we allow the grace of God to get inside of us. Every time we allow God's Spirit to work in our lives, for that living water to flow in our hearts and in our minds, it is like a refreshing, bubbling fountain inside that gives us hope, gives us focus, gives us perspective, gives us new vitality for the struggles ahead. Will we do everything perfect? No. Will we do everything right? Probably not. But we will experience the grace, the justice, and the mercy of God. And as we live in this particular year of tremendous change and difficulty, it is good to know that God's Spirit is at work in our lives, that we don't need to look for utopia, that place that is nowhere, because we know there is a new Jerusalem to which we are headed, that shining city on a hill that reminds us again and again of the need for justice and mercy in our world. God bless you. You have a wonderful day. Hope to see you in church.